Hello. Today's lecture is going to be on the origin of American politics. And so, initially when America first became a country under George Washington's leadership, Washington, hated the idea of political parties. He had been watching Europe for a very long time, and the political party system in Europe, because it's a parliamentary system, and which allows for many different political parties, which allows for more radical political parties. There's been lots of civil war, essentially because of the party system in Europe, and so Washington has been very afraid of that. And really has warned against the creation of political parties, or as he likes to call, factions. Political parties are essentially inevitable in the United States. And ultimately, Washington's concerns aren't ever actualized, even though we do get political parties, because we end up with a two-party system. The fact that we only have two parties means that both of those parties essentially are going to be run by the more moderates of their political philosophy, instead of having multi-parties where if you don't like the moderates, you can split off and become a more radical political party. So our two-party system is really going to protect America from the fractionation that's happening in Europe. So the new Constitution was ratified in 1789, and so that gives us our current form of government. Remember that the original form of government under the Articles of Confederation, we essentially scrapped those. The system just didn't work. It didn't grant enough power to the federal government. So now that we have this new constitution that needed a more powerful federal government, the question then really becomes how much power. Right. So the federal government does now reign supreme. It has restrictions placed upon it. That's what the Constitution is. It's a set of rules for the government, but most importantly, it's a set of restrictions. And so, it's yes, we are going to give the federal government a lot of power, but we also want to make sure we protect liberty and freedom. And so there's going to be some restrictions. And so it's those two seemingly contradictory things that are going to ultimately end up creating the two political parties in the United States, the original political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. It's going to be a fight over, which one of those two ideologies is most important. So, the fractioning the political party system is something that during Washington's first two terms, because he's such a heroic mythical figure, that he's going to be able to avoid for the most part the idea of political parties, when in reality he really probably is closer to a Federalist than Democratic Republican. But because he's this national hero, he can rise above party politics. But when he leaves office, he's very famously going to give a speech warning about political parties and the rise of the political party system. And again, he was afraid of that because of the civil wars that have erupted in Europe, and that he blames on the party system. So during Washington's presidency, we're going to go through this really pretty quick. I think everybody has a good idea about Washington's presidency. He is going to serve two terms and then voluntarily give up office. There is no restriction on how many terms a president can serve at this point. That won't happen until the 22nd Amendment. So he just says, two's enough for me. Anymore, that's too much like a king, and he steps down. That will end up becoming the precedent, not the president, but the precedent, essentially the tradition, all the way until Teddy Roosevelt tries to break it and fails, and then his cousin FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, actually will break it. He will win 4 terms. So President Washington sets that that tradition. He's also going to set the tradition of having cabinet advisors, and so there's just this recognition that one person cannot possibly have the expertise to run an entire country, and so he is going to set up a series of advisors to help him. Become experts in the different areas of the American government. Going to be those advisors, the two most important, which will be Hamilton, who's in charge of the Department of the Treasury, so kind of the finances and economy, and Thomas Jefferson, who's Secretary of State, who deals with the foreign affairs and foreign policy. Those two advisors are going to have completely different views on how to run the government. Hamilton being the Federalist, which is strong federal power, and Thomas Jefferson being the Democratic Republican, who's going to say limited federal power, strong state power. Those two guys are going to, essentially create the first two political parties. And so they come out of Washington's cabinet. Again, the cabinet is just a group of advisors. There are four of them. There is the Secretary of War. We call that the Secretary of Defense today, just a little more PC. The Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General. So we already talked about Treasury State. I just talked about war. The Attorney General is the nation's lawyer, except essentially he's in charge of federal prosecution, and any kind of domestic policing. So essentially today the Attorney General is in charge of the FBI and things of that nature. So Hamilton is going to be the first cabinet advisor we're going to talk about. We're only going to talk about two, which is Hamilton and Jefferson. So Alexander Hamilton was born in the British West Indies. Very famously, John Adams called him the bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. So he is he's poor. He kind of the exact opposite background of a lot of the founding fathers. He starts out poor in the West Indies. His dad abandons him, so he's a bastard. Somebody without a legitimate father who's around, and really rises to power kind of on his own. He becomes Washington's assistant in the military, and because he is so effective in that role, he's organized and intelligent. He rises through the ranks, and Washington really counts him as one of his most trusted advisors. He eventually will study really hard. He's one of those self-made kind of men. Ends up becoming a lawyer, and then during the Revolution becomes a very strong Federalist. A proponent of federal power. As a matter of fact, he is going to write the majority of the Federalist Papers, which are the papers that argue for a strong national government and a system of federalism where we divide the government between the federal, the national power, and the state governments. And so he actually writes 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers. So, and that's the series of documents that essentially convinces everybody of the need for a strong federal government. So during the Washington administration, like I said, he is the Treasury Secretary and is the strongest proponent of federalism, right? So he wants the strong national government. He recognizes that, Europe at the time is actually manipulating the states. So each state is kind of doing its own thing, and that's a problem. And so the British are using the fact that we're essentially fractionalized, and they're making like separate trade deals with one state over another, driving down prices, really manipulating everything. And Hamilton recognizes we have to get our stuff together if we're ever going to be able to keep the British from manipulating us. And so he wants a strong federal government. He wants a little bit more involvement from the federal government in the economy. He really sees America as an industrial power. I mean, before industrial power is like a thing. So he's in favor of merchants and industry and business. Not so much like Jefferson with the importance of farming. So Hamilton, what's his plan for the government? Well, he to create a more unified America and to put the federal government in control. He wants to have the federal government assume the war debt, and so again, kind of by taking on that war debt from all these different states, it will relieve some of the pressure. It's going to put the federal government in a position of power over the states, sets up that kind of relationship, and it really is something that we need to have happen so some states don't fail and then can be potentially manipulated by European powers who really at this point don't think America is going to succeed, right? The British still have forts in American territory. They're waiting for us to fail. As a matter of fact, in 1812, we're going to have another war. That's really kind of our fault. We picked that fight, but they have forts where they're not supposed to have forts in our territory. And so they're waiting for us to fail. Hamilton knows that. He wants to make the state strong, so he wants to assume that debt. The problem is that, a lot of the northern states have a lot of that debt, right? A lot of the fighting happened in Massachusetts. A lot of that area is in debt. The southern states, they're not in debt from the Revolutionary War, which means that they would be the ones, making the biggest economic sacrifice to pay off other states' debts. And so you really see that we are going to be sectionalized here. Sectionalism is just the idea of different regions of the countries or different sections of the country have their own different interests and don't necessarily get along. And so the North wants the federal government to take the war debt. The South doesn't because they essentially are going to be paying for it. So the South didn't like it because the North had the larger debts. So Hamilton knows to be able to assume that debt and stabilize the economy in the country, he's going to have to give the South something they want. It looks like the national capital at this point is probably going to be in New York City. Right, that's a win for the North. It kind of makes sense. It's a major port city, and will eventually become a major industrial and financial center. And so that's looking pretty good. There's other ideas about having a capital in Pennsylvania, but it's a lot of the talk is in the North. There's larger populations up there, and so Hamilton decides, well, to get the South on board, he will support a national capital being located in the South, which will give the South some prestige. And so essentially, if they agree to help pay off these debts, the South can have the prestige of having the capital located in Southern territory. Now, the capital, when we get Washington, D.C., and that's essentially what he's making the plans for, it's not going to be a part of a state. It's going to be its own independent thing. But having it located in the South does send a signal to the world that the South is this important part of the country. And because of the cotton industry, it is a very important part of the American economy. So, how is the U.S. going to pay this debt back? So he gets the deal passed. How is he going to be able to convince the American people? How are we going to pay for it, right? And how's that going to happen? Well, we don't have an income tax yet. That's the 16th Amendment. We got a long while before that happens. And so, how does the government get money? Well, some of you might be saying, well, just print it. Well, back then money was backed, right? And so it wasn't just paper. You can't just print it. And even today, you can't just print money. It comes at a cost. You can do it, but there's a cost. It causes inflation. And we'll talk about that in future lectures. But we got to figure out a way to get money. And so the reality is governments, and this is a pretty important concept to understand if you ever want to understand politics and economics, is that the government doesn't make money, right? It only takes money. And so, it takes it to pay for services for the people that it takes it from, right? And so, but at the end of the day, the money is, the citizens' money. And so we've got to come up with a way to figure out how to pay off these debts. And so what Hamilton comes up with is the idea to pass a tariff. Well, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So that means, anything we buy from the British, if there's a tariff on it, and say it's a $1 tariff, well, it makes all British goods $1 more expensive. Now, that pays off for those debts. That helps the North, right? But it also helps the North in other ways, right? The South makes their money by farming. The North makes their money by making things. So let's just say hammers. But it's all kinds, thousands of different things. So if we put a tariff on British goods, the North really likes that because one, this tariff's meant to pay off their debt, but they like it for another reason. It makes British hammers more expensive, which means more people are likely to buy American goods. Well, you think, oh man, that's great. Everybody wants, Americans to buy American goods, but hold up, that's not good for everybody, right? It's not good for the farmers in the South, right? The farmers in the South, they're farmers. They got to have hammers, right? And so they want to be able to buy the cheapest hammer possible. They don't like this tariff because the cheapest hammers possible back then were British hammers, right? So imagine it this way: an American hammer cost $2, a British hammer cost $1. Right. So all of a sudden now the cheapest hammer a Southerner can buy is the British hammer for $1. If we pass a $1 tariff on British hammers, now both hammers are $2. And so you just essentially, the cheapest hammer you can buy now is doubled in price and it's $2. But when we pass these tariffs, we don't just pass the tariff as $1 because then all of a sudden, it's not clear whose hammer you're going to buy. So instead of passing a $1 tariff on hammers, we pass a $2 tariff on hammers. And so that way the British hammer goes from $1 to $3. Now, whose hammer are the Southerners going to buy? They're going to buy the American hammer, which is probably not as good as the British hammer because the British have been industrialized longer. And so they get, for twice the money, they get a hammer that's not as good, right? And so the North loves that. The South hates it. Now, also, right, rich people don't necessarily mind that much because if a hammer's, goes from $1 to $2, they can afford to pay that. But poor people, right, who are just struggling to get by, if the price of hammers double, guess what? They can't afford a hammer, right? And so, these tariffs, my point is that these tariffs are good for the North, but they are going to upset the South, right? And so we're going to do quite a few things here in the next 100 years or so that are going to, less than 80 years, they're really going to upset the South, right? And ultimately end up in a civil war. But this is kind of one step on the way. And so we pass the tariff that the Southerners don't like, and we also pass what is known as an excise tax on whiskey. So this is a different kind of tax. An excise tax is like a sales tax. And so the tariffs are put on foreign goods, right? So that's just British hammers. American hammers don't get any more expensive. The excise tax is a tax on whiskey, right? So that's whiskey's being made in the United States. And so this is a tax that's really going to hit all Americans. It's going to, make whiskey, more expensive for everybody. Now, what you got to understand is, right now people are like, oh, so there's a sales tax on whiskey, because that's essentially what it is. Big deal. Well, the problem is whiskey has, in the Western regions of the Americas, it is in a lot of areas being used as a currency. Right. The money is not in this time period. It's not as stabilized as it is today, and so there's inflation and all kinds of exchange rate issues. And so a lot of farmers the way that they trade is essentially they barter with whiskey. Whiskey has become incredibly popular. We've got Western corn farmers, grain farmers out west that, because the transportation system is so poor, imagine you're shipping corn from far out west, and it's got to travel hundreds of miles on like dirt paths and whatnot, and can take weeks or months to get to market. Well, what happens to that corn when it takes that long to get it to market? Well, it rots. And so these corn farmers are growing all this corn, and they can really only sell it locally, and that's not making enough money. And so they have all this extra corn that's just rotting. So what can you do with it? Well, you can mash it up, ferment it, turn it into whiskey. Whiskey doesn't go bad. And so, in large parts of the West in particular, whiskey is how farmers are making ends meet. It's how they're making money. Now that's going to have a problem later with when we talk about prohibition and alcoholism rates, because whiskey's nothing to mess around with. But whiskey has become an important part of American life, and so when you start to tax this whiskey, you're really putting the livelihood of these farmers at risk. And remember, these farmers are, many of them are Revolutionary War vets, right? And so they just got done fighting a war that was about what? If you said no taxation without representation, ding, 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 you're a winner, right? And all of a sudden now, Washington, this removed government with leaders that they didn't probably vote for directly, passed a tax on their whiskey on their farms. Well, they just got done fighting in a war where all the leaders said, if you don't like your government, you have the right to overthrow it. So what ideas do you think start circulating in these farmers' minds? Right, revolution. They start thinking that way, which is a common thought back then. Keep in mind, these farmers also, many of them that were Revolutionary War vets, were promised paychecks and never got it. So they feel like, hey, government, we fought for you and you said you were going to pay us and you didn't pay us. And now that we're finally making a little bit of money selling whiskey, you're going to tax us? Right? They're going to start to get very upset by that. And so this tax on whiskey is going to upset many Americans, including and mostly Western Americans, right? So now, to be able to handle this tax collection, and all these debt payments, Congress will create the Bank of the United States. This is going to be super controversial. We'll talk about this later when we talk about President Jackson and his war on the bank. But this is a lot of Americans are going to have problems with this, because it's really going to start to centralize monetary policy in the federal government's hands. It's a thing that states and localities had control of up until this point. And so, many people, primarily in the South, are going to have problems with finance being centered through a national bank, and one that maybe doesn't have Southern regional interests at heart. So now Hamilton's doing all these things, but he's not doing them without some criticisms. And so there are many people that are upset about these taxes, the taxes that have been created, and the precedent of federal government power. They feel like that these policies are very similar to British policies that had been, just forced onto the colonies. And so Thomas Jefferson is really going to be their spokesperson. He's the Secretary of State at the time, right? One of those four cabinet officials, Washington's cabinet officials. And he's going to constantly be arguing to Washington, you got to stop siding with Hamilton. And Washington has been saying that he's not a part of either one of these political parties, but he keeps siding with Hamilton. And when he keeps siding with Hamilton, finally Jefferson says, you know what? like I've been here advocating for the states. I've been here at, saying that these taxes are too much, and that he's been advocating for the South and for the West, for the small farmer, for individual liberty and freedom, and he feels like Washington's ignoring him. So eventually, he's going to resign, and head back to his plantation. Now, eventually, he stays active in politics. Eventually, he ends up becoming our third president. But this is the rift, right? This is when Jefferson starts to politically combat Hamilton. This is the beginning of the two-party system that we will ultimately end up with. So, what are the differences between the two guys? Well, the first difference is in how they interpret the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution is a pretty limiting document when it comes to the federal government's powers. And so Hamilton, to get around this, comes up with a theory of the Constitution, which is called loose construction, which means you can interpret what the Constitution says, that you can that there are implied powers. And so, for example, which gives the federal government a lot of power. And so one of those implied powers is, okay, well, the Constitution says we can set up a post office. And the Constitution essentially says the federal government only has the powers that are spelled out for it. So, it says we can have a post office, so we can build a post office. Well, our federal government also builds roads. Well, how do they have the power to build roads? Well, if you believe that you can only do what the Constitution says the federal government can do, then it can't build roads, right? So what Hamilton says is, no, of course we can build roads. It says we can build a post office. Well, to be able to deliver mail, our postmen need to be able to get to where they're going. So we must have a road to do that. And so to have an effective post office, we have to have roads. Therefore, the federal government can build roads. So that is loose construction. That is actually how most people interpret the Constitution today. In reality, everybody interprets, every political party and scholar interprets the Constitution at least a little bit. But for the most part, we recognize, yes, there are implied powers, and those implied powers give the federal government a good amount of power. This means, like Hamilton believes in a strong national government, that national federal government, right? Washington, D.C., our president, Congress, the Senate, the Supreme Court. He believes that they should reign supreme. It means that federal taxes are okay, a national bank is okay, right? And he believes in supporting business and manufacturing. He sees that as the economic future of America. The people who believe what Hamilton believes will be referred to as Federalists. Now, Jefferson, on the other hand, believes in strict construction of the Constitution. And so strict construction of the Constitution means that the government can only do what the Constitution says it can do, and there's no interpretation there, right? You can only do what the Constitution says what you do. It says the government can only do what the Constitution says. And so this is the way that modern conservatives or Republicans view the Constitution. Democrats tend to view it as loose construction, right, that you can interpret. So strict construction means you can have a post office, but the roads, they have to be built by the states, right? The states have those powers. And so he believes in strong state governments. Let me move my little window box here. He envisions America as, a bunch of small independent farmers, lots of freedom, not very many restrictions placed on you economically or socially. A very limited government with lots of freedom. He will become an anti-federalist. That's what they were really referred to during the debate over the Constitution. That will evolve into the Democratic Republicans. And so, once Washington leaves office, it really the name anti-federalist becomes the Democratic. So that leads us to one of the first big events that is really going to solidify federal power in America, and that's the Whiskey Rebellion. So remember that whiskey tax that we were talking about. Let me move this back down here. So that whiskey tax. Well, West Pennsylvania farmers and other rural areas are going to believe that this tax is illegal, that their states didn't pass it, the federal government did. They don't think that the federal government should be doing that, and they're going to refuse to pay the whiskey tax. Well, when that happens, we're going to see that the records of some of the people who owe money for this tax is going to start to cause some of these small farms to be essentially foreclosed upon, and so these former Revolutionary War vets are being told that they owe this money and that they could possibly lose their farms. And so, what they're going to do is they're going to say, you know what? No, we're not only are we not going to pay, but we're going to smash the system that's trying to make us pay. They are Revolutionary War vets. They believe in this concept of no taxation without representation. This is, they are being represented here. It's just not the representation that they like. And so they think that any kind of tax like this has to come from the states and not from the federal government. And so what they're going to end up doing is they're going to start to, in the cities, they're going to start to, go to the courthouse, smash up the records of who owes who what, and really start to cause some really serious problems. And so Washington has got to figure out what's he going to do here, right? We have this long history of rebellion over taxes, but now that we're in charge and we're self-governing, we really can't just allow this to happen. We're a young country. We're still a baby. We're still in our infancy, and he needs to instill some order and show that the federal government does in fact reign supreme. And so, because these farmers are attacking tax collectors in government buildings, trying to destroy the records of who owes who what, Washington is going to have to step in. He's actually going to lead the troops himself. Remember, he was a general before he was president, and he's going to show the entire country that when the federal government legally passes a law, that it will enforce that law, and this will provide stability for the country. It's going to show that when the federal government says you got to do something, you actually have to do it. So ultimately, we'll go back here for a second. There's 400 rebels. 150 men will be tried for treason. 2 will be convicted. It's very hard to convict people for treason, and so 2 get convicted. And then Washington does something that he's just known for, which is being magnanimous. And so, which means, like he's conciliatory. He likes to make both sides happy. Good way to explain that. And so, what he's going to do is he wants to show that the federal government will enforce its will. And so, he smashes the rebellion. But after these men get convicted, he's going to issue them a pardon, and he's going to let them go back home. And he's going to say, look, I'm not here to send my fellow countrymen to jail. You got to pay your taxes. And I just shown you, if you don't pay your taxes, we're going to come and get you. All right. But, right, we're also willing to be forgiving. And as long as you don't do it again, then we're going to let you go about your business, and we're going to try and heal as a nation. And so, which is, I think, a very good thing for America. He really brought us together. Later, the whiskey tax will remain in place during John Adams, our second president's administration, but eventually, when Thomas Jefferson gets elected, he's our third president. Guess what he's going to do? If you guessed he's going to repeal the law, ding, 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 you're a winner, right? Because remember, he doesn't like these kind of taxes. So eventually, the whiskey tax will be repealed. Now, the next big issue is going to be Jay's Treaty. Jay's Treaty has to do with Great Britain and France. Both want us on their side in this conflict. The French really feel like they deserve for us to side with them because they sided with us during the Revolutionary War. There's no doubt about it. If the French wouldn't have helped us during the Revolutionary War, we wouldn't have won that war. And so, we owe it to help them. Great Britain says, hey, look, you're like our estranged cousin. We speak the same language. We have a similar style of government, traditional religious values. Our economies are connected, and the British essentially want us to side with them as well. Well, Washington doesn't want to have anything to do with any of it, and so he doesn't want to side with anybody. And so the United States is being pressured to pick a side. Now, Great Britain has kept forts manned with soldiers in American territory after the Revolutionary War and out west in territory that's not settled yet. The Royal Navy, the British Navy, is seizing American ships in the West Indies and pressing the soldiers. Essentially, they're saying that guy right there, that American right there, that's not really an American. That is a runaway British sailor, and we're going to make him be a sailor in our military. And they're using that to fight the French. So, America can't have this. And so, what Washington is going to do is he's going to send John Jay, who is the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's going to send John Jay to Great Britain to work out a treaty with the British. And so while Jay's there, we don't really have anything that the British need to be able to get a good treaty, except not to side with France, right? And so, when Jay goes over to the British, Washington and Hamilton essentially are going to allow Jay to kind of capitulate to Great Britain or give in to Great Britain's needs. And so John Jay will go to London to negotiate this treaty. And this treaty's really kind of going to kind of be a disaster and lead to problems later on. So what does he get? Is he going to be able to get the British to leave their forts? Is he going to get us to stop impressment? Well, he will get Great Britain, GB, that means Great Britain. Also, I'll switch back and forth, Great Britain, England, but Great Britain. To leave its forts in the Northwest Territory. But it's not going to get protection for American shipping. So the British are going to continue to kidnap American citizens and use them as their sailors. Now, this ends up being wildly unpopular because shipping is a huge part of American industry, right? Where the cotton trade and the slave trade are a big part of the American economy. And so the fact that our sailors are still being taken, not only does it hurt us economically, it's also insulting because where our Navy's just not strong enough to stop them, and we really have effectively no Navy. We do have, but it's like. And so this will ensure peace with Great Britain, but that's going to come at a cost, right? We kind of look like punks because we didn't stop them taking our sailors. And guess who it's going to upset? If you guess the French, ding, 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 pat yourself on the back. The French who helped, literally, we have to thank for the creation of America, right? We needed their help against the British and they gave it to us. Now they need our help against the British and we don't give it to them. Now, I'm not saying that Washington was wrong here, right? He just thinks, I don't want to get involved with Europe. We don't want to pick sides with anybody. We don't want war with Great Britain. We don't want war with France. We're going to mind our own business. Remember, our nation, we're infantile. We don't have a big military. Our economy's not super strong yet. We're really fragile. We just want to focus on us and get ourselves developed and not get caught up in the drama that is Europe. And so that's his intentions. But the French are going to have a real problem with that, and it's going to cause problems later on down the road. And we'll talk about that in future lectures. So, it's at this time that Jefferson is, really going to be solidifying his political party, the Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans. Don't confuse that with the political parties today. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, neither one of them are similar to the political parties that we have today. A lot of people say, well, the Federalists are like Republicans because they're in favor of business. Well, yeah, but they're also loose constructionists, which is a Democratic thing today. And people say, well, the Democratic Republicans, they're states' rights, so they must be they must be the Republican Party. Well, not necessarily. It's definitely more complicated than that. And so the Democratic Republicans, they're more states' rights, which that is today kind of a Republican concept, but they're more for farmers and not business, which is certainly not a Republican idea today. So the opposition to Hamilton and his ideas are growing, in particular because of the John Jay Treaty. Artisans and farmers are flocking to the Democratic Republicans. And so now it's at this point that we have our two political parties formed. And a political party, just so you have the definition, or faction. So Washington called them factions. But a political party is just a group of people who seek to win elections and hold office to be able to control government programs and policies. So Washington, who hates the idea of political parties, really sided with Hamilton more often than not. I think, in reality, he was a Federalist. He doesn't run for the third term, setting up that precedent of 2 terms again, which will stay in place until the Roosevelts. And in his initial farewell address is going to warn against multiple things. He's going to warn against sectionalism, which we talked about in the beginning of this lecture. But the most emphatic warning is going to be the warning against political parties. When Washington leaves, his successor is going to be the vice president, who's John Adams. He's going to run against Jefferson to replace Washington. Adams is an ardent Federalist, and so the Federalists will remain in power. All right, that's where we're going to leave off the lecture for today. We will continue our lecture series with John Adams and his administration tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a good day.